There was a landmark study, I think it was out of Harvard, looking at intern work schedules, which found that extended shifts, so the extending kind of from day into the night, and then sometimes, and I'm not sure if this was the case, but like sometimes they're 24 plus 4 or something like that. It's even longer than 24 hours. That sort of a model was associated with a greater risk for medical errors compared to shorter shifts.
Welcome to a special bonus episode of Critical Care Time, the podcast for everyone who cares for the critically ill. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Mark.
And I'm your other host, Dr. Cyrus Askin. Good to see you guys back. And it's just been 1 week, so happy to have you here.
And from our perspective, it hasn't even been that long.
That's
we
true.
are back to continue our conversation about sleep in the ICU.
Right. And ironically, we thought it would make it really special to do this when we were both working nights. So I'm here working in Wisconsin. Nick is working his usual gig in the Seattle area, and everything is awesome, just like the Lego movie.
That's right. Everything is awesome.
Everything's
Just
good.
like Daniel Day-Lewis, Heath Ledger, Christian Bale, we are method actors, obviously. So we
Right.
decided to, get into character, wake up a little early and record this continuation of our conversation from last week.
So last week, if you guys listened to us, we spoke a lot about the biology and physiology of sleep. We focused primarily on our patients, those that you guys care for as nurses, respiratory therapists, pharmacists in the ICU, physicians, PAs, NPs, everyone that works in the ICU has at one point or another taken care of a patient who has to sleep. And so on this episode, we decided to flip the paradigm and focus on you guys, specifically how sleep physiology matters for you and your jobs, especially those that have to work nights, of course, in the ICU.
So grab a coffee, turn on that full spectrum light, and join us. We're gonna talk about sleep, something that we all need to do, and we can all do a little better. Okay, so in part one, we talked about sleep in the ICU, something that literally 100% of our patients need to do.
And yeah, absolutely. So working in the ICU, it's a 24/7 proposition. We can't stop working at night. We're
It's
not
not a
an
bank,
outpatient
folks.
clinic. That's right. So many of us, and sometimes everyone has to kind of shoulder this load, but at least a lot of folks will have to work at night. Nick, you in particular are a bit of a night owl. I feel like that is where you make your ends meet. Tell me a little bit about how you survive that lifestyle.
Yeah, so I've been doing nights for a little while now. I mean, I've been a noctensivist, a night ICU attending for 10 years. I also, back in my EMS days, I worked a lot of night shifts. So it's something that I've been doing for a while. And I gotta say, I think nights are great. But in another sense, maybe a truer sense, physiologically, nights are kind of terrible. And so I think, we gotta sort of acknowledge the good and the bad and talk about kind of how you can minimize the bad and maximize the good in order to make nights, physiologically good for you. So maybe the place to start then is to talk about kind of the pros and cons of nights. Like, why do I love working nights in the ICU? First of all, there's more undifferentiated illness. So there's a diagnostic challenge that's frequently present at night. Second, there's more procedures and particularly, life-saving procedures. So there's sort of a procedural challenge and reward. Um, Definitely a pro and a con. There's less backup available. There's fewer people in the hospital. So you have on one hand greater autonomy, on the other hand, more rests on your shoulders. I personally think nights are fantastic for teaching. There's potentially downtime that's great for educating people. On the flip side of that, there's also downtime that's great for reading and learning and teaching yourself. Finally, I think there's some other benefits. There's less paperwork at night, so you spend more of your time saving lives and less time fighting with LTACs or insurance companies for approval. And then finally, that generally working nights is higher compensation. So the same salary requires fewer shifts, meaning you get to do the job you love, but you get to spend more of your time with your family. So all of that, I think, is good stuff.
So, in other words, for you specifically, Nick, you've managed to lower your threshold for success because it's undifferentiated illness. So, I mean, it's like whatever happens, kind of happens. You get to do procedures and not really think that much. You just do the procedures. You don't have to interact with as many people. You get to hear yourself talk more. You make more money and you do less admin. That's I guess how I look at it.
Yeah. No, thanks for restating it. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
that shoe fits, and I proudly wear it.
I love it, dude.
Yeah, yeah. Mo money, mo procedures, mo diagnostic challenge. Yeah, I love it. Now for the bad news. So, in many cases, working nights is working against your ingrained physiology. And when you fight physiology, there are some inherent risks. Um, First off, there's an increased risk of car accidents. According to the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, people who sleep 6 to 7 hours a night are twice as likely to be in a sleep related crash as those who sleep 8 hours or more. And people who sleep less than 5 hours increase their risk 4 or 5x. According to the American Nurses Association, they did a survey that found that 1 in 10 nurses reported that they were involved in an automobile accident that they believed was related to fatigue. So this is a very real risk that affects a lot of us. There's also an increased risk of medical errors. Sleep deprivation can increase certain types of errors. It's hard to know how much of that is actually due to night shift and sleep deprivation versus other factors, like there's less staffing, there's fewer clinical pharmacists or no clinical pharmacist in the ICU to sort of catch your errors. So I think this is hard to attribute, but certainly accidents can happen at night, and some types of accidents are more frequent at night.
Yeah, Nick, I think that those are definitely forces that I've had to contend with as well. The issues with sleep, feeling like you're not as sharp, feeling like you're driving home sometimes you're like, man, I'm not quite as awake as I'd like to be, and that's definitely worrisome. Now, this phenomenon has been explored more rigorously than just you and I, shooting the breeze on a podcast. I can't speak to the entire body of literature, but I know there was a landmark study, and I think it was out of Harvard, looking at internal work schedules, which found that extended shift, so the extending kind of from day into the night, and then sometimes, and I'm not sure if this was the case, but like sometimes they're 24 plus 4 or something like that. It's even longer than 24 hours. That sort of a model was associated with a greater risk for medical errors compared to shorter shifts. Nick, what's your sort of take from that?
Yeah, I think this is a family friendly podcast, so I'm not going to say no. No shoot, I'll say. Um, I think we know from aviation, we know from trucking, we know from diverse fields that shorter hours are safer. I think it's no surprise that going from 4 interns working 24-hour shifts to 5 interns working 12-hour day shifts and 12-hour night shifts reduced errors. I think the controversy comes from the fact that when other places tried to replicate this, and they did it maybe without adding that fifth intern, so they didn't scale up staffing, they didn't consistently find benefits. I think shift work is also very sensitive to how you implement it. If you don't have good sign out, if you don't have safe transitions, maybe your mileage may vary. But I think I know a lot of people will say, "Oh, shorter hours have not been proven to reduce errors with blah blah blah."
Right.
I think there's a diverse body of literature that staying up a long time makes you more likely to commit errors. And
Right.
medicine is not a different field than every other field. So,
Right.
like, like it's not rocket science. And actually, if it was rocket science, we know that it would be true there too, because we know
Right.
that sleep deprivation in space is also bad.
Yeah, the risks of like not being sharp in our line of work are not insignificant. So I don't think it should be, discounted. And even if you're like, okay, fine, whatever. Well, Nick, as I understand it, there are several very real kind of medical issues that are sort of heightened or worsened in potentially in those that work at night. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So not only is there an increased risk of medical errors and car accidents and things like that sort, but there's also just adverse health effects. There's a couple of good studies and a meta-analysis that we will link suggest that there's an increased risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes associated with night shift work, including an increased odds ratio for preterm delivery, miscarriage, and other complications. So a significant risk. Most of that risk was in studies that looked at extended shifts, though, not necessarily night shift. So there's a little bit of overlap between the two. Another really important thing that we talked about in part one was that sleep deprivation is associated with impaired glucose tolerance, reduced insulin sensitivity, and there is an association between night shift work and increased BMI among night shift workers. For example, the UK Biobank study found that among workers who classified themselves as usually or always night shift workers, there was a 16% higher risk of cardiometabolic disease compared with day shift workers. They also found that, yeah, that was more true in people who had a morning chronotype. So people who were kind of fighting against their own biology, working nights, seem to be more affected.
I'll be honest with you, Nick. I feel like I eat my feelings a lot of the time when I'm working nights, and sometimes, I mean, I'm not sure. I guess different shops are different in this regard, but um, there seems to be uh, the positive, like more camaraderie with night folks. I don't know. I just feel like that's a thing, and so
Yeah,
with
I
more
agree.
camaraderie, there's more like kind of bread to go with the circus, um, and uh, and then there's also, to your point from earlier, less of the administrative burden, perhaps a little bit more downtime, a little bit more time to kind of enjoy in that camaraderie. And as humans, often that involves potlucks and desserts and things of that nature. So yeah, I can't say that I'm that surprised, if I'm being honest with you.
Yeah, I think, and with regards to eating your feelings, I think try to eat low glycemic index feelings and try to do it
Mhm.
earlier in the night.
Mm,
We could talk more about that in a second. I mean, I think,
yeah,
you're right. There's some challenges, and I think I, I think you're right. There are some challenges, but I think there are also some countermeasures, things that we can do deliberately to
right.
reduce the impact of that.
Right. So there's one other area that we wanted to talk about, Nick, and this was a bit controversial. I think it's the association between working at night and cancer, increased risk of cancer.
Yeah, and so this is interesting. There have been a couple large observational studies that have suggested that there is an increased risk of cancer among night shift workers compared to day shift workers. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classifies night shift work as a Group 2A probable carcinogen to humans. So that sounds bad, right?
Yeah.
Um, but this is a complex story, and we could seriously do a whole podcast on this. I can't do it justice right here, but I will say that I think it's not a straightforward increased risk. There's probably a lot of other confounders in here. So, for example, like there was this famous nurses' health study that found a higher risk of breast cancer among night shift workers, but that hasn't consistently been found. There may be other associations, like the association with obesity, higher estrogen, higher risk. There may be other behavioral choices too. There may be more smoking among night shift workers. So I think it's not clear that it's the sleep itself as opposed to other things that are increasing the risk. I also would point out that there have been a couple large studies that have found no increased risk of breast cancer or other cancers at night. I think the bottom line is, this is probably something that we should all know about if we work nights, and we should all sort of try to make decisions accordingly. But I'm not sure that this, is the like the smoking gun that it's been made out to be in some articles about it.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a complicated, controversial proposition, and like you said, one that could be unpacked over the course of an episode, as opposed to a few minutes in this one. But yeah, we just kind of wanted to make sure that we touched on that at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, I think, concerningly, there's a meta-analysis of 17 studies that found that compared with regular daytime workers, the pooled risk of all-cause mortality with nights was 1.02, with confidence intervals that stretched from 0.99 to 1.06. So potentially a risk signal there. I think, we're not doing RCTs here. We're not randomizing people to work nights for their whole lives. There are behavioral differences. There are other things. But I don't know that I would, quit your job hearing this. But I think it's just a reminder that, this may be something where we need to be diligent about our health and wellness if we do work nights. I'd also point out that these risks are small at the individual level, but they're probably meaningful at the population level. There's like 15 million people in the US who work nights. Significant fraction of healthcare workers work nights. And so I think it behooves us to do what we can to sort of understand the pros and cons of this and make better choices. Like I said at the beginning, we have to figure out how to adjust our physiology, not fight with it. Because if you fight with your physiology, long term, you are going to lose.
So, Nick, I think we've unpacked some of the risks, some of the benefits. At this point, I think we can safely say, at the very least, in our career field, people need to work nights. Got it? Great. Cool. So, based on the information that we have at our disposal, does it make more sense for some folks to work nights and some folks to work days? Should everyone shoulder that burden? What is healthier?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't think we have great data on that. I do think that increasingly there's sort of a professional group of night shift ICU workers. Describe myself as a noctensivist. There's a bunch of us in my group who work primarily nights. And I think that that is a good paradigm. I think, selecting for people who like the job, who feel like they're good working under those circumstances is probably better than forcing everybody to work a few nights. Obviously, there's some jobs that, like if you're a CT surgeon, you're coming in at night sometimes to deal with emergencies. That's just part of the job. So, I mean, that, it depends on specialty. I think the paradigm of making people flip back and forth between days and nights is probably not the best. I think sometimes, jobs will sort of like require people to work nights for a few years, particularly in nursing, before they quote get to go to days. I think that's one way to do it. I think it's probably better to let people choose the shift they want to work, the sort of to thine own self be true model. There's some biology here that we touched on in the last episode. We talked about this idea of chronotypes, people who are night owls or morning larks or in between. And there's some good evidence that people who are night owls may be better suited to working nights. Surprise, surprise. Fun fact in researching this, I came across a meta analysis in the quote, Journal of Learning and Individual Differences, very high impact, that found a association between evening chronotype and overall intelligence. Quote, eveningness was found to be positively related to individuals' cognitive ability, yet negatively related to indicators of academic achievement. Um, so
Mm. Talk the talk, you walk the walk.
smarter, but less academically successful, I suppose.
Got it. Yes, the shoe fits.
I do think, maybe instead of saying who's good at nights, maybe you could also flip it around and say who's bad at nights, who's ill suited. So there's actually tools like the morningness, eveningness questionnaire, which I'll include in the show notes. It's basically I think it's like a 20 question test where you answer questions like, would you rather wake up and work out at 4 a.m. or would you rather stay up and work out at 4 a.m.? I don't know. Both sound kind of rough.
Yeah,
But the
neither.
idea is that you could sort of like see what your preference is, and maybe get a hint about that. It's kind of a fun test to do. Another factor I think is just sleep requirements. As we talked about in part one, the median amount of sleep required is 7 to 8 hours, with a standard deviation of about 1 hour. Night shift people may be the people on the left side of that curve, right? People who require more than 8 hours of sleep a night may be less well suited to nights. People who not just survive but thrive on 6 or 7 may be well suited to nights. We hope you guys are enjoying the episode so far. I know we are. Briefly, we'd like to take a moment to thank our returning sponsor, C-Star Medical.
We are fortunate and grateful that this episode of Critical Care Time is sponsored by C-Star Medical, returning once again to support us in our quest to bring high-quality critical care education straight to your eyes and ears.
C-Star Medical is advancing the science of cell-directed extracorporeal therapy to help restore the balance of a dysregulated immune system in acute kidney injury and sepsis. Check out their website, www.cstarmedical.com, to learn more.
That is SEASTAR medical.com. They were recently awarded the Corporate Innovator Award by the National Kidney Foundation for their Quellimune therapy. We wish them all the best as they continue working to bring this therapy to more and more patients across the globe.
Congrats to C-Star, and thanks for the support. And with all that, let's get back to the show.
So maybe we can unravel this a bit further. So if you happen to be in a position where you must work nights, based on what information we have available, how can you really optimize for that? How can you sort of structure your life around the need to work at night?
Yeah, so I think you have to do a bunch of things right. Just like we talked about with patients in the ICU, you have to be mindful of the Zeitgebers, the cues that your body uses to know what time of day it is, and you have to try to be deliberate about shifting those. We'll talk about things like exercise, light exposure, meals, medications. There's a lot of optimizations that you can make it much easier and I think safer to work nights.
Okay. All right. So let's maybe get into those then, Nick. Let's see what optimizations specifically can we make?
Okay, so let's talk about light first. So, two parts to this, or maybe three parts to this. One is you want to sleep in darkness as much as possible. You're sleeping during the day, so this means you really ought to have like blackout curtains. You want to make your bedroom as dark as possible. Um, you could also think about an eye shield as well. You really, really, really want to avoid exposure to those wide spectrum blue sunlight wavelengths that trigger the suprachiasmatic nucleus. The other thing that I try to be deliberate about is when I wake up and I'm going into nights, I try to deliberately expose myself to as much bright sunlight as I can when I wake up in the afternoon.
So you try to deliberately expose yourself.
Yes, exactly. Go near the reactor, expose yourself. This could mean you go outside and you're in actual sunlight. This could mean, if you live in Seattle for part of the year, it might mean using a full spectrum light, but try to give yourself, at least like 10, 20 minutes of bright light exposure when you wake up to show your suprachiasmatic nucleus that it's daytime. The other thing that's important is on the flip side, when you're coming home from work or you're winding down at work and you're about to go home, is avoid blue light exposure. And there's a couple elements to this. So, when I go to work, it's like top off, I'm in the sun, it's great. When that's top off of the car, by the way.
I'm kind of confused. You're exposing
Yeah.
yourself. You're taking your top off.
Yeah,
What's going on here?
exactly. Yeah. Um, Top off the car. On my way home, top on, hat on, sunglasses on. I look
So
like I'm like
Unabomber.
an yeah, I look like I'm like an actor hiding out from the paparazzi or something, And so I think, being very deliberate about avoiding sunlight exposure on your way home so you don't get those visual cues on your way home. There's some studies that show that blackout blinds significantly increase melatonin and reduce sleep latency in shift workers. Kind of no surprise there. If you're in the dark, it's easier to fall asleep. There are some studies showing that eye masks improve total sleep time and sleep efficiency by 15%, which is a pretty big boost. So I think, darkness when you're sleeping, brightness on your way into work, and avoiding sunlight on your way home helps. Um, Sometimes people will also talk about things like avoiding blue light when you're at work. So, like, you could wear glasses that block those wavelengths. Fortunately, like, there isn't a ton of sunlight in the ICU, but, you know, I do little things like I have my Epic, my EHR set up for dark mode. So maybe I'm getting less of those wavelengths. I don't know. I think the big thing is sleep in a dark room, bright sunlight when you wake up, dark on your way home.
Awesome.
Other things that you can do to sort of optimize your sleep environment. Obviously, you'll sleep better if it's quiet. Um, so I think things like earplugs, white noise machine can make a big difference. Another big optimization is temperature.
Mhm.
Human beings, we tend to sleep much better in a pretty narrow temperature range of like about 60 to 70 degrees. If it's warmer than about 75, our sleep efficiency drops markedly. And if it's below about 60, we wake up much more frequently. So just sleep in a room that's the right temperature. Cool, but not cold.
So Nick, what about um, we've talked about some of the nuances of how you approach sleep, but what about just the basic question of when you go to sleep when you're working nights?
Yeah. So I think some of this depends on what your shift schedule is. So some of my colleagues like to work like 10 nights in a row. And for them, I think sort of very deliberately sort of ramping into nights, working nights, and then ramping out of nights is a good way to do it. There's a fantastic paper called How to Travel the World Without Jet Lag, which has some really good strategies for this. I think if you're doing a long stretch of nights, it really behooves you to sort of, you know, approach it like you would an international trip. If you're working a shorter set of nights, I usually work 5 in a row, you could be a little less deliberate about it, I find. Like, I try to sort of spend one day before where I stay up late, I try to shift later, and then the day after, I try to force myself to sort of stay up and then go to sleep at a normal time. So I do the same thing, I just do it in a more abbreviated way. Um, Assuming you are doing a longer stretch of nights, essentially the idea is, for a couple of nights before you start nights, try to stay up late and sleep in and try to push yourself a little bit. That way, when you flip on to working nights, you're kind of already somewhat accustomed to that, and then sort of pull it back. We'll talk about melatonin a little later, but that you can use that as an adjunct to help you with this potentially.
Awesome. Okay. So another, I think, big element here that you and I are both fans of. Actually, I was a little late to recording because I was doing this exercise.
Mhm.
So I think exercise is a pretty important zeitgeber. And my understanding, Nick, of the literature here is that really the timing of your exercise, just like the timing of these other things we've discussed, matters, and perhaps almost as much as the approach to exercise itself in the context of exercises as like geek. So yeah, I mean, I think like when you're working nights, exercising later in the afternoon, kind of before your shift, kind of helps ramp you up, gets you in that kind of like activated, aroused state to where you're ready to hit the ground running. And then conversely, I think when you're switching back to the land of the living, um, continue to exercise, but doing so earlier in the morning after waking up has perhaps the same effect, helps you transition back to days a little more effectively.
Yes, exactly. There are a couple studies that suggest that um, light to moderate exercise before night shift improved subjective alertness and reduced fatigue, whereas exercise after working nights worsened the latency for sleep onset. So sleep, when you wake up, it's good to expose yourself to light and then exercise, and that helps sort of give your body cues that it's now daytime. Um, Personally, I think that one of the most important things is to just do something. Uh, it's very easy when you're working nights and you're tired to let exercise fall by the wayside. And I think like 20 minutes every day goes a long way. It doesn't have to be, you're not gonna PR necessarily on nights, but like a little bit does a lot. Right. And I view this kind of the same way that like astronauts on orbit need to do like exercise to avoid muscle and bone density loss. Like if you're working nights, you need to exercise to like help preserve healthy sleep architecture and just as a physiologic countermeasure to sleep and fatigue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point because at the end of the day, your mental acuity and your ability to show up to work ready to go has a direct impact on your patients. And so, if you want to optimize for safe, effective patient care, then um, taking these different elements into account, exercise being one of them, it's really something that you're doing, yes, for your own health and your own good, but also for that of your patients. It's a good way to motivate me and perhaps our listeners on those, I don't know, I guess days when you wake up and you're like, oh, I don't know, I'm pretty tired. I don't know that I can make it to the gym. Uh, Maybe that's a little extra motivation.
Yeah. 10 minutes is way better than 0 minutes.
Now, I know another kind of element of this. We talked about exercise. What about eating? So, I mean, I guess you got to eat big to get big. So you probably need to be at buffet right before you show up to work, right?
Yeah, obviously, all you can eat buffet is the secret tonight's success. So, there's a lot here, right? And this field is sometimes called chrono nutrition. And being intensivists and not like wellness influencers, I don't think we're going to spend a huge amount of time on this topic. But a couple of points to make. Timing of meals and the glucose and other triggers that you get from eating is another important zeitgeber. This tells your body, hey, it's wake up time. The biology here is complicated. Essentially, the idea is that your GI tract has, just like your brain, an inherent day night cycle. Remember from part one, we talked about those clock proteins that sort of have this 24-hour cycle built into the cell. Well, that applies in your GI system as well. Your glucose tolerance is circadian. You tend to handle glucose better in the morning and less well at night. And there's some evidence that quote circadian misalignment can cause trouble with beta cell function. Your You literally just don't secrete insulin as well at night. Um, Now the challenge here is that while we have really good tricks like sleeping in a dark room and exposure to bright light and caffeine and stuff like that to help you flip your brain to nights, we don't really have a way to flip your GI tract to nights. And a lot of the literature suggests that maybe you just shouldn't. You should flip your brain to nights, but try to keep a sort of normal day eating schedule. Um, Specifically, there was a 14-day randomized trial where they found that daytime only eating during night work preserved the sort of alignment of central and peripheral clocks and avoided that rise in glucose seen with nighttime eating. They also found that people had less quote mood vulnerability when they avoided eating a lot at night when working night shifts. Um, and they also found that some of the adverse cardiovascular effects, like rising blood pressure at night, were blunted when you didn't eat a lot at night. There was an RCT of firefighters. These are people working 24-hour shifts, not 12, but in involved nights, where they found that a 10-hour time restricted eating window for nighttime improved cardiometabolic endpoints and quality of life versus eating all night long. Um, I think there are more studies going on here. Obviously, these are usually small studies, they're not blinded. I think the bottom line is that there is some evidence that you should not try to flip your schedule, like completely from when you eat in the day, just flipping that 12 hours. You should actually try to preserve that somewhat.
Yeah, and that makes great sense to me just as an N of one. Kind of joked a little bit about eating my feelings, but what I found is that when I am tempted to uh, join in the 2 a.m. potluck or something like that, I usually feel pretty crappy. I do a lot better when I sort of wake up, exercise, maybe have an apple or something like that, um, grab some food, get into work, usually eat around 8 p.m. or so. And then really I do try to make it until basically breakfast time when I eat like normal breakfast type foods before going to bed in an hour or so. Uh, Sometimes it's tough, again, maybe that 2, 3 a.m. Period rolls around and I have a little snack or something to just kind of get me through. But yeah, at least from my perspective, that totally makes great sense.
Yeah, I think, like you, I wake up, maybe have a snack, exercise, have dinner with my family, go to work, and then I call it because I'm, obviously token fan, second dinner. Like I'll have a dinner at work, maybe between like
Right.
8 and 11, and then I like you said, I try not to eat after midnight unless I'm
Yeah.
like, feeling like really, really, really I need a boost, and then if I do, I try to have like a healthier snack if possible. I think one of the big challenges is that hospitals have vending machines for junk food, but not for salad. So I think, it's a good idea to bring some healthier snacks with you to work, even if you're not necessarily going to eat them every night. But I think trying to preserve that like meal architecture, both from just like a biological standpoint and just socially. Like it's nice to eat a meal with your family before you go to work. And then
Yeah.
you know, you can engage in that potluck, but do it before midnight, and then try to
No,
try
it's
to get that 10-hour time restricted eating window.
Yeah, Nick, great points all around. And your comments on the vending machine. So I've seen more and more when I've been traveling. I've been traveling a lot. Those, I can't remember what the company is, but they're like vending machines that actually do have these like high protein, high quality salad shakers of various
Hmm.
varieties. And so my wife tried one and it was pretty dang good. I mean, at the end of the day, it's coming out of a vending machine, but it was quite good, all things considered. And so I do wonder if maybe hospitals could start incorporating things like that to where it's not just Kit Kats and Hershey's bars. Nothing against Kit Kats and Hershey's bars. I have my fair share, but maybe diversify the options, especially for those of us that are working at night. And cafeterias typically aren't full steam ahead at 3 in the morning.
Yeah, I think we'll probably finish this episode by talking about like some system-based measures, and certainly if you want to have a healthy workforce, providing healthy food is kind of a no-brainer for hospitals. But yeah, I like that. If whatever the makers of Robo Salad want to sponsor our podcast, we'd
Yeah.
we'd love that.
Yeah, that would be actually. I'm intrigued because that would actually be, I think, an interesting space for a company like that to move into. Because I haven't really seen much of that in hospitals. Um, so anyway, moving on from investment opportunities, exercise, eating. Another somewhat controversial strategy that I've seen implemented is this idea of banking sleep before you start nights. The idea being that you're trying to get some additional sleep prior to going on to nights. We were kind of talking about this in the context of shifting your schedule around. But I think that there have been a few studies that have found this to actually be effective. Perhaps there's a little bit of evidence behind it. As far as how you approach this, though, Nick, what strategies have you utilized?
I mean, I think the idea of sort of staying up later the night or nights before you start working night shift is a good idea. I
Mhm.
think going into your first night shift, if you can take a nap in the afternoon, that's very effective. You can't always do that, but sometimes, if you can, it's good. I think,
Okay.
sometimes people refer to this as banking sleep. And there are some studies showing that of all the strategies that mitigate fatigue, this is maybe one of the most effective. Sort of trying to push, if you normally sleep 7 to 8 hours, trying to get 9 hours of sleep going in can make a difference. So I think it's a good strategy. I think, your mileage may vary. Some people are better at napping than others.
Right.
But I also always tell people that, like, you know, rest is almost as good as sleep. So if you lie in
Yes.
bed and read a book and, maybe you nod off a little bit, but you don't have to sleep for hours
I
to,
was going to say
maybe
that.
feel rested.
I've had the same experience where like I'll because when I'm working nights again, the vast majority of the time it's not at home, so I'm like waking up early, getting on a plane, flying somewhere, so on and so forth. So I'll get to my hotel usually early afternoon, and I'm going to work that night. And typically, there's not a whole lot to do. So what I try to do is I get here, black out the room, lay down, try to nod off if I can, or if not, just listen to some like very kind of either white noise or like quiet music, something that's maybe going to lull me to rest. And then I'll get up, try to get a good workout in, shower, and go to work. And I found that that has been a pretty reproducible and effective strategy for me.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, when it's been studied, like, among residents, it was one of the best strategies, and, it doesn't have to be a 6-hour nap. Like, I think it can
Yeah.
just
Right.
be relaxation, and you can still get some benefit.
So now that I've shared with you guys sort of my strategy for sleeping prior to work. Nick, what do we have as far as literature or recommendations for sleeping at work should the opportunity present itself?
Right. So first, some nomenclature. So if you sleep before work, that's called, quote, banking sleep. If you sleep at work, people refer to this as strategic napping, which
AKA
sounds,
sleeping on the job.
yeah, exactly. But I think first of all, we should point out the obvious that, like, this is not sleeping for many hours. This is usually short naps. This is usually like 30 minutes or so. And I want to just sort of push back on the idea that this is a bad thing, that there's really nothing shameful about taking a nap. It means that you are efficient about getting your work done. You have a little downtime. You're using that to raise your own level of alertness, to take better care of people. You'll be at peak performance afterwards. So I mean, it's not that you're lazy, it's that you're doing this as a deliberate strategy to help people. Obviously, if you're like a super deep sleeper and you can't answer your pager or whatever, like, this is maybe not for you. But I think, there are several studies that suggest that taking short naps during a night shift is a good strategy. So, for example, there was a study of ED nurses and physicians that found that taking a 40-minute nap at around 3 a.m. improved cognitive performance up to 7 a.m. in clinicians working 12-hour night shifts. There was a study of night shift aircraft mechanics that found that taking a strategic 20-minute nap during the first night shift significantly improved the speed of response on a vigilance task measured at the end of the shift. And then a systematic review concluded that, quote, brief duration naps, less than 30 minutes, can improve sleepiness and or fatigue while reducing the risk of impaired post-nap performance and should be considered when performance is critical. NIASH, that's the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, has a great section about strategic napping that we'll link in the show notes. But anyway, this is a tried and true strategy. Obviously, don't skip out on your work to sleep, but if you have the opportunity to sleep at work, I think it can be a very good strategy to improve your fitness. Um, I'll also say that, like, this is something that we should encourage people to do and make it easier. So, like, for example, in, one of my hospitals, we made like the nurse break room, like a blackout quiet room with a comfortable made bed. So it's very easy for somebody to use 30 minutes of their hour break to get some rest. I think that makes a big difference and that can improve safety. So, there's no stigma to sleeping as long as you're responsible about it.
So we've now spent a good 20, 25 minutes really talking about some of the non-pharmacologic ways we can optimize our life as a night owl, being the good intensivists that we are, trying to be, trying to focus on those non-medication options. But let's get to the fun stuff. Let's talk about the drugs.
Better living through chemistry.
So we said earlier that actually, really, in our first discussion of sleep for our patient focused episode, that one of the primary mediators of sleep is lower ATP, resulting in adenosine buildup.
And so there's basically two things you can do about this. We can block the effects of that adenosine, or we can try to increase the amount of ATP and prevent there from being as much adenosine. The first one is a very tried and true strategy. We've been doing this for thousands of years. This is with caffeine. So caffeine is the world's most widely consumed psychoactive drug. It enhances wakefulness, physical performance, and cognitive performance. There's some amazing evidence about it, not only just increasing your performance on lifting and cardiovascular tasks, but also cognitive tasks and alertness tasks. So caffeine is great. There was a Cochrane review that found that caffeine improves performance in shift workers. No surprise there. There was an RCT that found that caffeine reduced errors while driving when people were fatigued in a simulated night driving task. So caffeine is great, right? But there's a lot of nuance here.
Right. There's definitely a lot. I mean, it's good, but dose, route, frequency. If we're going to talk about it like it's a medication, let's treat it like it's a medication. So you can't just write like an order that says this
Titrate to effect.
medication, right? This medication, PRN dose, PRN interval, so on and so forth. I'm going to bed to take my nap.
Right. And I think one of the challenges is that there's a lot of different forms of caffeine, whether you're talking about coffee, tea, energy drinks. It also comes in other forms, like NASA and the military have done a lot of experiments using like gum and
Mhm.
pills, stuff like that. So, I mean, how you consume caffeine matters, but there's also a lot of person to person variation. So, for example, the half life of caffeine in most people is 3 to 6 hours, which is already a wide range. But there are people who are faster metabolizers that can be less than that. And there are people who can have a much longer half life, like over 12 hours. And so, if somebody tells you if they have coffee in the morning, they can't sleep in the evening, that may be true. There are people like that. There are also people more like myself where, like, I can have coffee and then 2 hours later take a nap just fine. So, I
That's
mean,
yes, that I is resonates with me. I can like pound like a triple espresso and go to bed within 30 to 60 minutes, no problem. It has not been as helpful to me as I wish it could be.
And I think the key thing is that caffeine is not just about avoiding sleep, it's about enhancing alertness, right?
Right.
So it's not that you use it as a strategy to not fall asleep, you use it as a strategy to be more effective when you're awake. I think another thing, I mean, speaking of like the metabolizers, like if you do like 23andMe or one of those like things, you can find out your genotype, right? Like there's a CYP1A2 polymorphism here where there's fast metabolizers and slow metabolizers. But I think honestly, who cares what your genotype is? Like, this experientially, right? Like what works for you. Um, I said this up front, but like NASA and the military have done a lot of work trying to find optimal dose and route. I think the consensus of this literature is that you should front load the caffeine on your shift, meaning that like wake up, maybe take some caffeine before you go to work or right when you get to work. Um, and then I like to think of this as sort of a bolus and a drip model. Like take a like a sort of a loading dose of caffeine, and then, kind of maintain it with some more during the first half of my shift. And then I try to avoid caffeine during the second half of my shift. The idea is to sort of enhance alertness and then let it sort of wash out. And so I can go home and sleep. Um, if you're a fast metabolizer, you could probably push this a little later. And I sometimes do. Like sometimes I'll have an energy drink or something at like 3 a.m. And it doesn't really limit me from falling asleep at 8 a.m. But I think it's just like there's a lot of sort of personal customization here required, both in terms of what's your preferred type of caffeine, when you like to take it, and how much works for you. So that was kind of how you can block the effects of the adenosine that ATP turns into. But what if we could just increase the amount of ATP you have in your brain? That sounds great. Well, it turns out maybe we can't. There's a couple studies recently that suggest that creatine may be helpful as a strategy to mitigate fatigue and enhance performance in night shift.
Yeah, so creatine can be a very helpful tool to the night shift ninja. Can also, of course, be helpful as a. It's perhaps the best studied. Actually, I don't think there's really any equipoise. It is really the best studied nutritional supplement as it relates to fitness and exercise. Very good, very robust data to support the use of creatine. The idea here is that you are trying to optimize or enhance the way in which you buffer energy metabolism by forming this phosphocreatine. It's essentially like a supply of phos groups ready to be used to rebuild ATP. It's like a little warehouse. And so the more creatine you have readily available, the more phosphocreatine you can produce, allowing you to more efficiently regenerate ATP. Like I said, kind of creatine gets a lot of attention for its physical benefits in the gym, but we are sort of recognizing there are also cognitive benefits too, including improving performance during sleep deprivation. And there's actually some evidence that creatine supplementation can reduce nocturnal fatigue and improve performance. So in this particular group that we're talking about, night shift workers, there's some good support for the practice there. Now, most of the studies that we have, they're small trials looking at healthy athletes who are exposed to sleep deprivation. So perhaps, again, your mileage may vary. But what they're looking at typically is measuring reaction time and working memory, as well as athletic performance in these populations. Um, as far as, we talked about this with caffeine, but as far as the dose, it's not really clear. There's some evidence that it works best if you're taking it chronically. So like I'm, going to get off this call, quick shower, get some creatine and water, and head out to work and grab some coffee on my way into work. That's my plan. That's what I do when I'm working days. I'll do the same thing. I'll take 3 to 5 grams a day, but I'll do it in the morning. Um, there's other kind of studies, other data suggestive of taking higher doses, maybe taking a single high dose as opposed to taking it chronically. Um, you know, I haven't done that. I don't know, Nick, if you've done that, but that's not my approach.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like, I mean, if you like go on Reddit, there are people who talk about like creatine insomnia. They take a high dose of creatine and they can't sleep, which is maybe kind of a hint about the mechanism here. I also take it daily with
Right.
exercise. 3 to 5 grams seems to be like a reasonable human dose. There was one study that will link where they found that a single high dose that was like 0.3 mgs per kg, so like 30 grams for me. Um, is, maybe an alternative way to do it. I don't know. I mean, that's a lot of powder, or it's a lot of gummy
I
bears, you
feel
know?
like it can cause a little bit of like GI upset. It's
Yeah.
when you're like getting started with creatine. After you've taken it a few times, it really doesn't have that effect. But I'm not sure that I would want to take 10x what my usual dose is and just test the waters.
Yeah, exactly. I think, it's a reasonable supplement to try. There's great evidence for safety, there's good evidence for efficacy, and there's emerging evidence that it may enhance performance at night.
Right.
So, yeah, I've been using it, and I think it probably helps. I've tried the higher dose, and I'm not sure that I can really perceive much of a difference other than I just ate, like, 30 creatine gummy bears,
Excellent. So,
which are
okay.
tasty.
Yes. So moving on from creatine, yeah, we can't really talk about nights and night shifts. I mean, we could even do it on the first part without discussing melatonin. So maybe Nick, you could break down the role of exogenous melatonin for our audience here.
Yeah, so melatonin is an endogenous hormone released by the pineal gland that helps with sort of sleep promotion, right? It sort of level increases over the day and helps us fall asleep. Um, as we said, it probably has pretty modest effects when taken as a supplement. There are a couple of studies that have looked at it as a strategy to help shift workers adjust to night shift work. So, for example, there was a randomized double-blind crossover trial of 15 ER docs who got melatonin or placebo, and they found basically no effect on self-reported recovery, sleep quality, sleep duration, etc. Um, there was another study in night shift nurses that reported that melatonin helped with slightly shorter sleep onset, but the effect was very modest. It was like, 10 to 15 minutes quicker falling asleep, and that's about it. There's really no consistent evidence that melatonin reliably improves daytime sleep duration or sleep architecture in night shift workers. Um, that said, I think a lot of that's because people use it wrong. So, if you go to the store, you'll often see they have these high dose formulations and they have sustained release formulations. And in my opinion, both of those are exactly what you don't want, right? Sustained release basically ensures that you will wake up still feeling the effects of the melatonin and still feeling tired. And high dose saturates all your receptors and, gives you kind of zero order elimination kinetics. So you have the effects for longer. So but all of those are doing is enhancing daytime fatigue. So I think if you're going to do it, you want to do a very low dose, like 1 to 3 milligrams, probably erring on the lower side. Another interesting point. So there was an article in JAMA this year where they actually looked at what was in melatonin gummies. And spoiler alert, it's not what you think. They found that only 12% of the brands that they looked at contained the advertised amount of melatonin. One contained 347% the advertised quantity. So imagine taking
Nice.
a low dose and you're actually getting a high dose.
Good
Um,
value though.
and then and even more worrisome, some of them didn't contain melatonin at all, and they had CBD in them. So imagine
Mm,
you fail a drug test because you took what you thought was a melatonin gummy or something. That doesn't
no,
seem great.
no, doesn't seem great. Um, now,
I think if you find yourself wiggling your fingers, listening to Fish, and like eating Doritos, you may have had the latter.
CBD variety, yeah. Um, a,
Indeed.
co- a, a cousin to melatonin is sort of the synthetic agent, ramelteon. So the data, kind of as you alluded to, Nick, for melatonin as a sort of like sleep aid is not terribly robust. Probably has a little bit more of a effect as far as sleep architecture than really enhancing sleep latency. Um, but with Remeltion, at least the data that I'm familiar with there is that maybe it could be a more effective drug specifically in the realm of sleep latency. Now, recognize Remeltion is a lot more expensive, so it could easily be 10 to 20x the cost of melatonin on a monthly basis. But if you have access to Remeltion and melatonin hasn't worked for you, probably a safe thing that you could try to see if it helps.
Yeah. Um, Just on a personal note, I feel like I've tried melatonin for years, and I've never really felt like it helped me.
Yeah.
I do have a friend who's another noctensivist who has a very kind of contrarian take on this, where what he does is he takes a very low dose, like 0.5 milligrams, like 6 hours before he wants to go to sleep. And the idea here is that he's using it to kind of try to shift his natural fatigue. So if you're trying to sort of shift your going to sleep earlier, this might be a useful strategy there. They discuss this a lot in that How to Travel the World Without Jet Lag paper. There's some interesting figures showing this. We'll link it in the show notes. Personally, I don't do this, but I think it is kind of an intriguing idea.
Love it. Okay. So, can't really, I think, finish this portion of the episode out without discussing the hypnotics and the stimulants that are available for use. Maybe we could briefly go through those.
Yeah, so surprisingly ineffective, I would say, the hypnotics. So all of the Z drugs like zolpidem, zopiclone, etc. Um, there was a Cochrane review that suggested that hypnotic medications like these did not result in significantly longer daytime sleep duration compared to placebo. So it's interesting. They don't work as well as you might think. According to the American Association of Sleep Medicine circadian disorders practice guidelines, they state that hypnotics may be indicated to promote or improve daytime sleep in night shift workers. However, they do not reliably improve on shift alertness and should be used as part of a broader plan. So I think compared to the other things that we talked about, they're not necessarily as helpful as people think they are. I think sometimes people feel like they need something to fall asleep, and these will help you fall asleep, but they won't necessarily make you sleep that much better, surprisingly. So I think, use with caution. If you have a diagnosed sleep disorder, you're seeing somebody about it, that's a little different. But I wouldn't recommend these for people. On the other hand, there's also stimulants. So drugs like modafinil and its cousins. The military and NASA have done a lot of studies with these. They have found that these drugs can be quite performance enhancing for long periods of sleep disruption. So, for example, like bomber pilots flying 40-hour missions, these can be helpful. Um, However, it probably is not great as something you're gonna do every day, every shift. There was a study in the New England Journal of 209 people with shift work sleep disorder, and they found that people who were randomized to modafinil did have shorter sleep latency, slightly improved performance on a night driving test, and fewer self-reported near accidents. But they continued to have daytime sleepiness. So, kind of
Mm.
paradoxically, the hypnotics didn't make you they didn't really help you sleep that much better, and they didn't improve your night shift performance. The stimulants actually helped you sleep better, but maybe only marginally improve your performance. So I think these drugs get a lot of attention, but they're probably overrated unless you're flying, a stealth bomber, all the way to the Middle East or something.
Got it. Got it. So, so probably not neither kind of route seems to be a great option for the vast majority of folks. Anything else that you're familiar with? I feel like you told me you've got a colleague that maybe messes with a little DDAVP. Tell me about
Yeah.
that.
So this is kind of interesting. So a friend and I were talking about this once. Like, what is it that wakes you up when you are working night shifts? And a lot of the time you just wake up because you have to pee. And it got us thinking about this and reading about this, and we found some interesting studies. So in mice, they find that, and by the way, mice, everything is flipped, right? Because mice are nocturnal. So in darkness, mice are active, and in bright light, mice are asleep. But anyway, when you flip the light schedule in mouse cages, what happens is the mice don't generally urinate during when the lights are on during their nighttime. But when you change up the night schedule, they do, right? They get this incredible sort of change in their like kidney function. And it actually turns out that this is true in humans too, that like we always assume that everybody produces urine at a constant rate over 24 hours, but that's not true. People who have preserved sleep architecture don't make nearly as much urine at night. If you want to think about this in like an evolutionary sense, probably, it makes sense to not leave the cave at night and get eaten by like a tiger because you have to pee. So, there's like the same way that like, your insulin and glucose has this sort of intrinsic cycle, your kidneys probably have this intrinsic cycle too. And when you have sleep disruption from shift work, you probably do make urine at weird times and have to pee at weird times. So the interesting idea that my friend has is, what if you use nasal DDAVP to sort of suppress that to avoid waking up and having to pee? He's tried this. He thinks it works. I'm kind of intrigued by this idea. I think we got to figure out a way to do an RCT of this.
Right.
If
So
the
maybe not ready for a prime time, but it's a
Yeah,
cool
yeah,
concept.
yeah. If some sleep researcher is listening to this and you want to do this trial, we would love to have you on the podcast to discuss in the future. You know,
Awesome.
I think.
Love it. Okay, so as we come to the conclusion of our episode here, we spent some time speaking on various elements of this sleep question and how to optimize for working at night, how to earlier in our last week episode, how to optimize sleep for our patients. Okay, so taking one big step back, looking at the question globally, um, what can we do as you know medical societal change as medical society change agents to help the systems we work in make nights safer or better?
Yeah, great question and great note to end on. So I think you know, a lot of this comes out to just like respecting people and respecting their time. I think, one thing is when you build schedules for people, it's better to have a fixed, predictable schedule that people can adapt into rather than a schedule that's flipping around. So, better to work nights or days, not flip-flopping between them. Um, I think it depends a little bit on what your job is, obviously. If you're in residency or fellowship, things are a little different. But in general, doing a stretch of nights is probably better than doing one random night. Um, I think, there's probably other things we can do as far as like how we structure shifts, like when they start, when they end. Earlier sign out in the morning is probably better because then shift workers can avoid light exposure on the way home. Kind of fun fact. So casinos actually change when their shifts start and stop. That way their night shift workers can drive home in darkness and not be exposed to sunlight. Um, I've never seen a hospital do something like that, but it's kind of an intriguing idea. But I mean, if your sign out can be at 6 or at 7 or at 8, probably 6 or 7 is better than 8, right? I mean, you're avoiding a lot of sunlight exposure.
I love that. A couple other things we sort of talked about. Systems can encourage strategic napping. You mentioned what's being done at your hospital, Nick, in the nurses' break room, which I think is great. Um, and then also, just when we're having those shift changes, sometimes it's nice to catch up with colleagues. It can be tempting, but really, it's probably best to limit that so that night shift workers can get home before the sun comes up, before their ability to sleep during the day is hindered.
Yeah, I think keeping your intern there so that you can do the chalkboard talk at them, whatever, is probably not a great use of their time from a learning perspective. And it's certainly not a great strategy from a safety perspective. You know, I think of it as like, you're like a pumpkin, you have until midnight, right? And
Yeah.
like you really don't want to, turn back into a pumpkin on the road home. So like respect people's time, get them out of there. Don't do like "Oh, let's just talk about this for 15 minutes," "Oh, we'll do a little training on this at the end of your shift." Like, don't do that. People should sign out and get home. I think
Absolutely.
that sort of goes along with this sort of culture of safety about night shifts too. In residency programs, I think, we need to really actively encourage residents to use the call rooms to sleep before driving home if necessary. In some places, there just aren't enough call rooms, so people can't do this. I think it also needs to absolutely be normalized that residencies will pay for like Uber or Lyft rides home for residents who are fatigued. I think it's unreasonable to expect people to expose themselves and others to physical danger driving home when fatigued. And I think we need to just like push back on that. Yeah, and I think we need to just respect people's time. Nobody
Yeah.
wants to see your PowerPoint after working 24 hours. Just let them go home and sleep.
We got to this a little bit, but really, I think just for systems to remember that nights aren't for everyone. There are some people that are clearly wired to work nights, and maybe let those people work nights if that's what they want to do. Don't sort of like force folks that are morning people that struggle at night. Maybe try not to force them into working at night. It tends to keep folks happy and safe. And one last note that I think would be is interesting, Nick. Maybe you can elaborate on this. Is what we can do with our Congress people, specifically as it relates to daylight savings time. I know this is something that you're weirdly militant over, so maybe you could kind of help us
Yeah,
understand
yeah.
this problem.
So I have a long blog post that I'll link about why we should get rid of daylight savings time. I think the bottom line is that daylight savings time was initially created as a wartime measure to increase productivity, and it actually probably decreases productivity. It certainly wastes energy, and it exposes people to a lot of risk. There's car accidents every year because of it. It's a it's something we should just get rid of. So write to your congressperson. Tell them you want to get rid of daylight savings time. You want to go to permanent standard time. Um, I think, as a systems based measure, that would save literally billions of dollars a year. As a fun fact, the people who are pushing back on this is this weird coalition of like the candy companies who know they'll sell more candy on Halloween, the barbecue companies who know that afternoon sunlight is better for barbecuing, and then like golf courses that want to do this. So we have to stand up against the combined forces of those industries to convince Congress to act by getting rid of daylight savings time.
So, folks, thank you for listening to this kind of two-part discussion of sleep. In our first part, of course, we talked about sleep as it relates to our patients. And then for the last hour or so, we've talked about sleep as it relates to us, those of us that have to work at nights in the ICU, or I should say those of us that maybe have the privilege of working at night, because it can be a lot of fun and we get to do a lot of good work with our patients.
Yeah, I think we laid out the pros and cons. It's not for everybody, but it's a great job in my opinion. I love being a noctensivist. We've also outlined some important countermeasures that you can do to be safer and make your patients safer if you work night shifts. So hopefully this is helpful to you. Hopefully this will, prevent a few car accidents and a few medical errors.
As always, if you want to learn more, you should check out our show notes on our website, www.criticalcaretime.com. This is really this magnum opus for Nick, especially. He really took the lead on this as the resident noctensivist. So I expect there'll be a lot of great
Attending noctensivist, bro. Don't demote
yes,
me.
there you go. Sorry, apologies. The attending noctensivist. So I assume there's going to be a lot there on the website for you guys to enjoy.
While you're there, you can leave us a comment, subscribe to our mailing list. You could buy some of our cool swag like I'm wearing right now. We'd like to always end our episodes by saying thanks to our listeners. Thanks to everybody who's left us a 5-star review, comments, or given us a shout out. We really appreciate it. You guys give us great ideas and suggestions. A lot of these episodes come to you because of listener suggestions. So please keep those coming.
We hope you enjoyed the show. Please subscribe and give us a like. Give us one of those 5-star ratings like kind of Nick was alluding to. You can utilize your favorite podcast app to do that. It really helps us reach a broader audience. We really do love to hear from you guys. So you can tweet or X at us, whatever term you prefer to use these days, at Quick Care Time on X, or individually, it's Nick M. Mark. Askins_Razor. We're on Instagram threads. We're on YouTube. Just some permutation of Critical Care Time will get you to us.
So I've literally not updated that app in years, so it still has the blue bird on my phone. So it will always be Twitter.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I know. Strangely obstinate. Before we go, I'd like to say a big thanks to our production team over at Podpaste, who edit this and make it better. Kurt Belknap for our amazing theme music, which you're hearing now. Really takes a village. We appreciate all of you.
And finally, the views expressed within this podcast and any associated media do not necessarily reflect the views of our employers. All references to patients or encounters have been modified to be HIPAA compliant, and thus, any similarities to real-world cases are purely coincidental. Finally, this podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes only and should not be used in lieu of seeking medical advice. With that, thank you guys for listening. I'm going to take this opportunity to go work my night shift.
So am I. Yeah, it's time to go to work. Anyway, thanks, folks, for listening. I'm Dr. Mark. See you next time.
I'm Dr. Cyrus Askin. So long.